Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. The greatest American inventions. Today's invention is the one that, more than any other, made the digital age possible. Without it, no computers, no smartphones, no internet, no GPS. It is the fundamental building block of every electronic device made in the last 75 years. And most people have never thought about it for a single second, even though they're surrounded by billions of them at every moment of every day. That is the transistor. Before the transistor, electronic circuits ran on vacuum tubes, glass bulbs with metal electrodes that could amplify or switch electrical signals. They worked. ENIAC, the first general-purpose electronic computer, built in 1945, contained about 18,000 vacuum tubes. It weighed 30 tons, occupied 1,800 square feet, and consumed 150 kilowatts of power. And vacuum tubes burned out constantly. They were fragile, expensive, hot, and large. At Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey, then one of the greatest scientific institutions in the world, a team assembled to work on solid-state physics. The team was led by William Shockley, with key collaborators John Bardeen, one of the most exceptional theoretical physicists of the century, and Walter Brattain, a gifted experimental physicist with a talent for making things actually work. On December 16, 1947, Bardeen and Brattain demonstrated the first working transistor, a small piece of germanium with two gold foil contacts. It could amplify an electrical signal. Shockley, learning of their success, produced an improved design, the junction transistor, which became the basis for virtually all transistor technology that followed. All three shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956. The implications were immediately apparent to engineers, if not to the public. Here was a device that could do everything a vacuum tube could do, but solid state, small, fast, cool, reliable, and cheap. Bell Labs, under pressure from the government, licensed the technology broadly rather than keeping it proprietary. Any company could manufacture transistors, and they did. The first transistor radios appeared in 1954. Small, battery-powered, fit in a shirt pocket. Rock and roll spread partly because transistor radios made music mobile and personal for the first time. But the much larger development came in 1958, when Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments and Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor independently invented the integrated circuit, putting multiple transistors on a single piece of semiconductor with connections built in. Now you could put not just one transistor, but dozens, then hundreds, then millions, and then billions onto a chip the size of a fingernail. Intel's first microprocessor in 1971 contained 2,300 transistors. As powerful as the 30-ton ENIAC, smaller than a thumbnail, today's most advanced chips contain more than 100 billion transistors, operating at billions of cycles per second, each transistor smaller than many viruses. And the cost per transistor has fallen so far it is essentially zero. This progression, Moore's Law, has continued for more than 50 years, the most sustained technological advance in history, all built on the transistor. Bardeen, remarkably, won a second Nobel Prize for a completely different discovery, the theory of superconductivity, making him only one of 4 people in history to win the Nobel Prize twice. But here's what I find most remarkable about this story. It was born of basic research, not a military contract, not a crisis, not a specified commercial goal. just fundamental scientific inquiry into how electrons behave in solid materials, funded by a private company that understood, in a general way, that understanding electrons would eventually lead to better communications. Bell Labs didn't know what they were looking for. They were just looking. And what they found changed everything. That's the argument for basic research. You cannot always know in advance what fundamental knowledge will produce. You fund the best minds, point them at the hardest problems, and trust that what they discover will matter. Bell Labs in its heyday is one of the greatest arguments for that philosophy that history has to offer. Next time we move from the laboratory to the syringe, from New Jersey to Pittsburgh, and meet a doctor who asks himself, why should children have to be afraid of summer? The polio vaccine. Coming up, Dr. Alan Guelzo joins me to talk about why Abraham Lincoln still looms so large in American history, what his life can tell us about the American experiment, and how his legacy speaks to the nation as it approaches its 250th anniversary. That's next. I'm really pleased to welcome back my guest and good friend, Dr. Alan Guelzo. Dr. Guelzo is professor of humanities at the Hamilton School of Classical and Civic Education at the University of Florida. He's one of the nation's leading historians of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War era. Previously, he was the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Research Scholar and Director of the James Madison Program Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship, the Senior Research Scholar in the Council of the Humanities at Princeton University, and the Director of Civil War Era Studies and the Henry R. Luce Professor of the Civil War Era at Gettysburg College. He's quite a remarkable person. He's a New York Times best-selling author of more than a dozen books on Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, including his most recent, Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment. He's a three-time winner of the prestigious Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize and a recipient of the Bradley Prize. He's joining me today to talk about Abraham Lincoln and what his legacy can tell us as America approaches its 250th birthday. Alan, welcome, and thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here again.
You spent more than 3 decades studying Abraham Lincoln, and you've written over a dozen books about him. What is it about Lincoln that first captured your attention and then kept your attention?
A number of things. One is that Lincoln's a very complex person. There are many Lincolns to explore. And although people like to say, almost routinely, that 16,000 books have been written about Abraham Lincoln, that's a bit of an exaggeration. That 16,000 books with Lincoln in the title doesn't mean they're really about him. Actually, maybe it's somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000, but that's still a lot of books, and people say, is there anything new? My answer to that is all the time. All the time. The man had extraordinary intellectual depth and interests, and there seemed to be no pot of knowledge he did not want to put his finger into. So that's one thing. Another thing is, he is, after all, the President of the United States during our moment of greatest crisis and cataclysm. When we have fears and doubts in our own moments of crisis, who do we look to except to that president which navigated us through the worst of them, and we hope we can find some lessons from how he made that navigation possible. But in particular, one thing that I come back to in these times, probably more than any other, is the qualities that made his presidency so successful. When you look back to the previous presidents, go back, let's say, 10 years, what you see is a collection of mediocrities. Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan. And then all of a sudden, what do we get? At the moment when he's needed most, we get Abraham Lincoln. That's extraordinary in its own right. And then he navigates us through this crisis, but he does it with qualities that are really remarkable. Qualities like resilience, his capacity to absorb punishment, and he got a lot of it. His sense of humor. I mean, he was famous as a joke teller, but people sometimes missed the importance of that. He once said that I have to tell these stories. If I didn't, I would lay down and die. He liked the funny stories because they helped to compensate for the burdens he was carrying. He knew how to use that. He also understood, or at least came to understand, how the presidency operated. I say he came to understand because, remember, he's elected president in 1860. He has nothing that we would call executive experience. He's never been the mayor of his own town. He's never been the governor of Illinois. He's never been any of those things. And suddenly he finds himself in the White House, and he's got to learn on the job. Well, he learns. He's a very quick learning curve. Not only does he learn, but he looks carefully at every aspect of the job he has to perform. And he has what I think we would call the coup of the eye, in that he could look at these situations, size them up, evaluate them, and know what they meant. He wasn't stampeded by every set of data that came across his desk. Finally, I think what I admire tremendously in Lincoln is that having gone through this tremendous crisis, the loss of life, stupendous loss of life, he is able to say in his second inaugural address, where he could quite conceivably have simply taken a victory lap and congratulated himself and others about how righteous they were. He instead says, no, we have all been under judgment, North and South alike. Nobody's innocent. And it's because nobody is innocent that we must show malice toward none and charity for all. And to hear that being said by him at that moment, having gone through 4 years of war, that is a really extraordinary thing. He wrote a letter in July of 1862 that I often come back to. He wrote it to a Louisiana Unionist who was writing to Lincoln to complain about how Lincoln's generals were carrying on. And Lincoln wrote back to him and said, look, you people in Louisiana asked for this. But then he adds this, I will do nothing in malice. What we are dealing with is too great for malicious dealing. That's a really remarkable statement. And when I take all these things together, what I see that I'm looking at is a really extraordinary person, not just because he was president, but an extraordinary person just on his own terms, his American terms. He is the kind of president that you might say could only have been president in America. The only place where you could have seen someone make that kind of rise from obscurity and do it on the strength of these personal qualities.
After all those years of study, what still kind of surprises you?
Some things that surprise me about Lincoln, and I think are worthy of exploration, have to do with his political life in Illinois. Most of the time, our attention is going to be riveted on what makes him president and then his presidency. But he has a long political career in Illinois. Even before there's a Republican Party, he is a Whig. What makes this man a Whig? Why is he loyal to the Whig Party almost from the moment that the Whig Party comes into being? Why does he denominate Henry Clay as his beau ideal of a statesman? And what does it actually mean to be a Whig politician in Illinois? I mean, he served 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature. Had the Whigs been a majority party in the Illinois state legislature, he would probably have been the Speaker of the lower house of the Assembly. What exactly do we know about Lincoln's career as a politician in those days before 1854 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act? We don't know a tremendous amount, and I think that's a very important field to see developing. Another thing that I think is worthy of some interest is investigating Lincoln as a commander-in-chief. There have been books written about Lincoln as commander-in-chief, but most of the time they are dealing with Lincoln's personal relationships with his generals, which were often peculiar. With one of them, George McClellan, it's just 180 degrees difference. They just are not on anything close to the same wavelength at any point. He gives command after McClellan to Ambrose Burnside, who, even if you ask Burnside would have protested, "I'm not equal to this job." Lincoln gives it to him anyway and continues to reward him all during the war. Makes you wonder, why? Then there's Joe Hooker. Then there's George Meade. Finally, there's Ulysses Grant. Most of the time we deal with this as a matter of generals and president, which is a legitimate question, but it's not the only question that goes into the making of a commander-in-chief. And in many respects, Lincoln has to learn on the job. He does not always learn the right lessons, I have to say. I mean, I'm a Lincoln person, but I don't believe that the man walked on the Potomac. There were patches in Lincoln's understanding of himself as president that were a bit thin, shall we say. And I think those need to be investigated fully as much as any others. A third place where I think we could go is looking at how Lincoln involves himself with Congress. There are revealing moments when members of Congress, especially those who are critical of him, complain about the way Lincoln is able to twist arms, the way he is able to use the influence of the presidency. And I would really like to see more work done on Lincoln and Congress and the relationship between the executive and the legislative branches in his day during the Civil War. There are three big areas right there that I think could accommodate a good deal more in the way of research and publication.
There's so much to deal with Lincoln that by the time you get through the stuff that everybody kind of knows, you're almost exhausted in getting through all the stuff that we don't know. You've made a point several times, which I have repeated cheerfully to people all over Washington. Lincoln is managing a White House staff of 6. President Trump on his way to the G7 meeting. I think the White House brings 250 people. But you look at that and you think, the way the whole system has mushroomed, and then you go back to Lincoln himself going over to the telegraph office and sitting and waiting for information about various battles, and you compare that to how it evolved over time, there's something about how he managed his own time. He gets up in the morning, and is he dealing with Congress, or is he going to the telegraph office, or is he dealing with citizens who are wandering through? All these things are going on, and somehow he keeps it all straight.
He was, if I can use the term in an appreciative way, he was a workaholic. He would be up early in the morning. Breakfast for him might be an apple and a cup of coffee. And then it was right to work. And he would go straight through the day into the evening. He would be seeing people. He would be interviewing members of Congress. He would be reviewing reports. He would be writing letters. All this is going on all during the day. And what does he have? His office, his immediate outer office, starts out at the beginning of the Civil War with just 2 people. It'll reach that maximum of 6. 6 people, and he's managing a civil war. And we look at this and we think, how on earth did that happen? Because you could quite literally, in his day, you could walk onto the White House grounds, walk up the driveway, in the front door, and simply get in line to see the president. The word security barely existed. It was so thin, in fact, that the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, finally insisted on camping a company of soldiers on the White House lawn just to provide some kind of semblance of security. But Lincoln would go out and chat with soldiers. He'd sit there and talk with them. He'd walk down the driveway of the White House onto Pennsylvania Avenue to buy a newspaper from a newsboy. He is at this all the time, and probably the most interesting story about that comes the day after his reelection in 1864. There has been a big party the night before. Everyone's still recovering from it. But early the next morning, the day after Election Day, one of the staffers, who's responsible for the incoming mail, goes to the White House offices, and there he wants to make sure that things are in the right mailbag. He is surprised to find that Lincoln is in his office at his desk at work. Everyone else has taken the day off, but not Lincoln. And this man reflected in his memoirs how much comfort he derived from the fact that knowing that Abraham Lincoln was on the job on the day when everyone else was not on theirs. And that'll tell you a great deal about Lincoln right there.
When we come back, we'll look at how Lincoln's presidency changed the country and what might have happened if he'd lived to finish his second term. When Lincoln first gets elected, we are a very different country than we're going to be 4 years later. The forge of war, the stress of war, the necessity of organization, the scale of the system, all of that is going to lead to just extraordinary changes. How much of that do you think Lincoln understood and generated, and how much of it do you think he simply had to accommodate because it was happening and there's nothing he could do about it?
Well, in some respects, the Civil War gave him no choice. In 1860, the federal budget was calculated in the millions of dollars. By 1865, it's being calculated in the billions of dollars. And we're talking 1865 dollars. The extraordinary increase in the federal budget. Really, it takes the breath away to contemplate what was involved, because all these bills for the war and conducting the war had to be paid. So the federal budget is going to change. You have a dramatic increase in the volume of federal employment, because now you have to have more in the way of administrative staff, especially people who are going to be working in the quartermaster's department. They're not all going to be military. There are changes in the structure of things that are built into the Lincoln administration. What I think we have to also see is how temporary a number of these things were. That federal budget that balloons up to almost $2 billion in 1865 comes down dramatically by 1870. And it'll never go back to the levels pre-war, because you've got Civil War pensions that have to be paid. And Civil War pensions become the pig in the python, so to speak, for the federal budget. The federal budget will go back to about $26 million. But it does go back. It also goes back in terms of the size of federal employment. In a lot of ways, the federal government resumes a good deal of the size and the role that it played before the war. What has changed is the understanding of the legal and constitutional relationships. Civil War ends the notion that somehow the United States is simply nothing more than a loose federation of quasi-independent states. Now, the war makes it very clear. The states exist in a subordinate relationship to the federal union, and states do not have the liberty to contradict, to withdraw, to secede, to contest what the federal government is doing. Beyond that, there are some real difficulties in establishing exactly what kind of immediate changes the war creates. A lot of the times we think that the war creates industrial America. And we look at the Civil War and we say, well, to win this war, you have to have whole new industries that are called into being on a whole new scale. Well, yes and no. Because the kind of industries that do flourish during the Civil War are not going to flourish once the war is over. There are industries that are prevalent in the United States, which in fact suffer. Some of them, in fact, disappear during the war years. The industrialization of America, in fact, does not really happen on a large scale until 20 years after the war. We're talking the 1880s. I know that it's a common canard that the Civil War pits the industrial North against the agricultural South. I think that's an exaggeration. If you look at the North as it was the beginning of the war, some 72% of the districts represented by Northern members of Congress are rural districts. Even where there is manufacturing, especially in New England, it's very small-scale manufacturing. Your average manufacturing unit is composed of about 14 employees. In other words, it's the kind of small-scale shop, small producer shop, where the owner or proprietor is wearing a leather apron and he's down on the shop floor along with his employees. What really is at stake in the Civil War is not industrial North versus agricultural South. It's small family farm North versus large-scale plantation South. The industrialization factor is really not going to play a major role until we get really into the 1880s. And that's part of a long-term trend in the larger transatlantic economy.
Don't you, to some extent, with that description, discount, for example, the degree to which the northern rail system was radically better than the southern rail system and gave them both logistics and mobility characteristics that the South just literally couldn't rival?
Well, the rail system in the North is a good one, but it's not created by the war. The rail system was there a decade before the Civil War. In fact, the single largest rail system in the world in the 1850s was the Illinois Central Railroad. But the Illinois Central is up and operating in 1850. It's not a creation of the war. The rail lines of the South are substantially shorter. They're also, and this is a major limitation, they don't all function on the same gauge. So you've got this ludicrous situation where you could have two rail lines coming into a single city, but they can't move through that city because the railroad gauges are different. One reason why the rail lines are not as substantial in the South is the South didn't need them. The South relies for a lot of its commercial transport on the rivers. And they can do this because the South was blessed with much more in the way of north-south running rivers that allow the South to move their goods, in this case largely agricultural goods like cotton. It allows them to move it by steamboat, it allows them to move it by barge, by flatboat. They can use the rivers. They don't need the railroads the way the North needs the railroads. The railroads function for the North the way the river system functions for the South, which is also, incidentally, why it becomes so important during the war for the Northern armies in the Western theater to gain control of those rivers. Almost routinely, when you look at the campaign histories of the Union armies in the West, these are campaigns that are built around rivers. That's not the case in the Eastern theater. In the Eastern theater, rivers are something you have to get over. You don't use them. But in the West, it's different. And that really speaks a great deal about the Southern economy. So yeah, the Southern economy lagged behind the North in terms of rail connections, but that was because it really had a different kind of commercial network for transportation.
In Lincoln's last public speech on April 11th, 1865, he hinted that he had some new announcement to make concerning the South. This is obviously speculative, but given your knowledge, if he had lived, how different do you think the history of the next 3 years would have been?
Well, I have two ways of answering that. One is to say that, yes, I think things could conceivably have been very different. Because in the 6 months to 12 months before he gives that speech, he has had to see the landscape, the political landscape, the economic landscape of the future shift a great deal. He understands, for one thing, that once the war is over, the southern states are going to be restored to the Union. Well, if they're going to be restored to the Union, are they just going to elect the same people that caused this cataclysm in the first place? How is he going to keep that from happening? Well, he's going to keep that from happening by raising up a Republican Party in the South that is going to contest that kind of thing. Well, where are you going to get the recruits for that Republican Party? The freed slaves, which means it's going to be very important for Lincoln to move towards ensuring that they have the vote, that they have status as citizens. And I think that's certainly what we would have seen if Lincoln had lived, would have been some very energetic movement on Lincoln's part to encourage black citizenship, to encourage black Republican voting. He certainly had plenty of encouragement himself from black leaders in the North, like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass tells him very frankly, you are going to need a cohort of voters in the South who are going to support Republican policies. All right, we know where that cohort is. So that's certainly one direction Lincoln would have moved. I think he would have moved also in terms of economic enablement, because he understood very clearly that political and economic strength operates in tandem. You're not going to have political strength where people don't have economic strength. So I think we could have looked for Lincoln to take some very direct action in terms of property rights, in terms of taking the property that had been abandoned by Confederates, by Confederate leadership, and in the spirit of General Sherman's General Order 15, turn title over to the slaves, the former slaves who had once worked that land. In that respect, what Lincoln is doing is simply embracing John Locke's definition of property, which is you combine your labor with the soil, and that makes for property. So I think we could have seen that in Lincoln, and there would have been at least 40 acres and a mule for freed slaves. A third thing that I think we would have seen develop with Lincoln would have been a more aggressive policy in terms of Reconstruction itself. Ulysses Grant, years later, made the observation that the great mistake of Reconstruction was that the North did not maintain a military presence in the South at more than a token level and for more than a few years. Grant suggested that perhaps we should have done military occupation of the South for maybe 30 years. In other words, to give a new political generation to rise and come to authority and experience, a new generation that would have been completely different from the old slaveholding past, the old slaveholding oligarchy. So I think we could have seen, quite conceivably, based on what we know about Lincoln, I think we could have seen some movement in exactly those directions, which would have given us a very different outcome to post-war Reconstruction, which in turn would have yielded a very different outcome for our present-day arguments over race, over citizenship, over voting, over the economy. Now, having said that, Abraham Lincoln did not possess a magic wand. And even though we grant him the laurel as the president who is responsible for winning the war, I always have to keep in mind the possibility that the challenges of post-war Reconstruction might have been beyond even Abraham Lincoln. I mean, for one thing, he would have only had 4 more years in his second term. That's not a whole lot in which to make things happen. And the problems that Reconstruction deals with are so deeply rooted, so deeply entrenched in Southern life, that not even Abraham Lincoln might have had the charm for them. So on the one hand, yes, I could see Lincoln moving in those 3 directions. On the other hand, I also keep somewhere right on the edge of my thinking the fact that these problems are so enormous that perhaps even Lincoln could not have solved them.
The system you're describing, where you might have had in Grant's model 30 years of occupation, would have been dramatically more intrusive and much closer to a northern imposed dictatorship, as seen by Southern whites anyway. And actually, I never thought much about that because I've always thought of Lincoln as seeking more effective reconciliation. But when you look back and you look at what did happen in places like South Carolina, the problem was you couldn't reconcile with people who wanted a radically different world than the one you were willing to tolerate. I mean, it seems to me that it was a much harder problem than we've really admitted and that we've looked at with enough candor.
Oh, I think that's true. And contrast this with what we did after the Second World War. We did, in fact, impose a military occupation in Germany and in Japan, and we needed to do that. And the result was much, much more productive, We called into being and equipped a whole new political generation in both places. We empowered a Konrad Adenauer, for instance, in Germany. And we did that because we had a military occupation in place. And to some extent, we still have a military presence in Germany. It's linked with NATO rather than an occupation per se. But we did that, and the result turned out to be a positive one. It could, in fact, have gone the other way, because at the end of the First World War, we didn't do that. At the end of the First World War, we did something even more dramatic than we did at the end of the Civil War, and that is we unplugged things immediately. And what did we get as our reward for that? We got Weimar, and then we got Hitler. Should we have had some kind of occupation after 1918? Well, I don't know whether it would have been possible, but at least in theory, the result could not have been worse than what we got by 1933.
It's interesting looking at Lincoln in that sense, and you sort of, in this conversation, have broadened my own contemplative thinking about that Lincoln, had he survived, might have become substantially more controversial. The things he would have to have done to be true to the beliefs he had would have been, in many ways, less acceptable.
I think certainly what you would have seen would be a very different South. At the end of the war, many people in the North really assumed that what was going to happen was a complete makeover, that the South was going to stop being what it had been, a quasi-feudal oligarchy, and it was going to start looking like rural New England. It was going to start looking like Western Massachusetts. Nice little villages with clapboard congregational churches and small-scale manufacturing. And that did not happen. And one reason it does not happen is because there's no enforcement. There's no security for it. I came across several years ago, doing some research in the Library of Congress, I came across a letter of Frederick Douglass's that I had not known about because it had not been anthologized in any of the published versions of Douglass's writings. The letter was written on the back of a letter he had gotten from another person and he was sending back. In this letter, what he basically says is he has been invited to come to Alexandria, Virginia, and start a newspaper similar to the one that he was editing in Rochester, New York. His response was, if I come to Alexandria, they'll lynch me. So there's no security this way for the kind of changes that Lincoln would have put into place. It also means that even though you do develop this new Republican voter base, you're forcing the leadership of that into the hands of people who do not have serious experience as politicians. You have not given time for that to grow up in the South. You've got to have that generational turnover. And it didn't happen, and we have been paying the price for it ever since.
Coming up, we'll talk about America at 250 years and why the American experiment has endured. What's your feeling about, at the 250th anniversary, what do you think Lincoln would say if he were wandering around today?
I think he would be surprised and distressed at the cultural bifurcations in American life. With the overall American experiment, what is really remarkable is if you look at this from the 30,000-foot level, what is consistently remarkable is how committed Americans have always been to this Republican model. Newt, there has never been a serious monarchist party in America. No one has ever tried to put the British royal family in charge of anything in this country. And the only one that even looked like that, Harry and Meghan, simply became the objects of international laughter. There's never been any serious consideration of anything except the model of a republic in American life. And that is a consistency which is really fabulous and says a great deal, I think, first of all, for how Jefferson got it right, that when Jefferson said that it's self-evident that everyone understands that there is a natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that he was right. He was correct. It was not just a political statement. It was not just a legal statement. It was a description of human nature. And in that respect, the endurance of the American Republic owes a great deal to the fact that at its founding, it was built on the right foundation. Now, moving beyond that, what we've had to deal with has been dissension. We've had to deal with violence in the form of the American Civil War and other kinds of lower-level political violence. We've had tremendous challenges. We've had economic upturnings and downturnings. We have managed to cope with a lot of those. People today talk to me about how terrible polarization is. Yeah, it is. Although I have to point out to them, with a sense of consolation, that we have been dealing with polarization ever since the 1790s. In fact, we were dealing with polarization in the Constitutional Convention. If this had been easy, the Constitutional Convention would have lasted from May 1787 to May 1787. It didn't. It dragged on until the middle of September 1787. And why? Because it was so hard to get all of these people talking to it. And we're only talking, at this point, about 13 states. In fact, in the Constitutional Convention, you're not even talking about that because Rhode Island didn't want to participate. All right, fine. What you get, even in the Constitutional Convention, are people like a representative from Delaware standing up on the floor and saying, frankly, gentlemen, I do not trust you. If you want polarization, that's polarization, okay? And that's in the Constitutional Convention. You get Benjamin Franklin's grandson, who inherits his grandfather's publication empire in the Philadelphia Aurora, accusing George Washington of being a British agent. This is like John Birch Society accusing Dwight Eisenhower of being a communist. This is the 1790s, and we're doing this. And then, of course, you get the election of 1800 with Jefferson and all the controversy that swims around that. Andrew Jackson. I'm sorry, we are a nation that has been busy fighting with itself for a long time. Polarization is nothing new. Where I think the polarization is different today and seems to hurt more is that the polarization cuts down to a different level. We have been politically polarized. Oh my goodness, we've been politically polarized since we stopped fighting the British. What we experience today cuts down deeper to a kind of cultural polarization. It's not just that we're not talking to each other politically. That's happened a lot. That's nothing new, and we will survive that. We can survive that, at least. But we are now dealing with a kind of cultural polarization that we have not really seen since the Civil War. Because you cannot reconcile certain cultural standoffs. You cannot come up with a compromised position on some cultural issues. And that's where I see the real danger to the American experiment in our times. I'm not worried overly much about political polarization. We've always had that. If you want to get a good sample of political polarization, read the newspapers from the 1820s and 1830s talking about Andrew Jackson. It's the cultural polarization and the cultural alienation that I think is much more difficult for us to cope with. That is going to require a kind of leadership that we may not have had a whole lot of preparation for, but we're going to need it because that cultural division, that cultural polarization long-term can be more dangerous than political polarization.
You've been very generous with your time. We're asking everybody this. How will you be spending July the 4th?
I'll be spending it in Gettysburg, and I'll be spending it probably out on the battlefield. I will go to a number of places on the battlefield on the 4th. In fact, we'll do it in each of the 3 days prior to the 4th, because that, of course, is the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg itself. On the 4th, I will probably go to the Angle. I will go to the Angle, and I will remember that so much of the American future balanced on what happened through a half hour at that place. And I will be so thankful that it turned out the way it did. I was so thankful that I will not be thinking in terms of purple mountain majesties or amber waves of grain. I will be thinking of my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty. Of thee I sing.
It's amazing. It's wonderfully poetic. You're a great teacher and a great writer. It's an extraordinary privilege to know you and to be able to talk with you. I want to thank you for joining me, and I want to encourage our listeners to go on Amazon and order Our Ancient Faith, Lincoln, Democracy, and the American Experiment, or any of the great books Alan has written on Lincoln and the Civil War.
I now am contributing to a Substack called The Golden Thread with my old friend of 5 decades, James Hankins. And those who are interested in our Substack, it's articles on history, it's articles on music, it's articles on art, all of them about great moments in Western civilization.
Thank you to my guest, Alan Guelzo. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at Gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.